This is a game between Pokimane and XQC and PogChamps 3. The game begins with 1 d4, d5, bishop f4. This is the London system, and commonly comes to the London system you play going c5 and then developing your knight after the pawn, so you could pressure the center. Instead, we just have knight c6, e3, e6, attempting to develop the dark squared bishop, although it does temporarily block out the light squared bishop. Knight f3, knight f6, bishop d3, bishop b4 check. This is an unusual move, as white can just go c3 and continue developing, and this just slows the black side and quickens up the white's development. So we have c3, bishop d6, offering a trade of bishops. Now commonly the bishop will just slide back and it won't usually be captured, as if it were to be captured, the h file were to be opened up for the rook, and there are attacking ideas when the king castles kingside. Instead we have knight e5, the idea being she would want to have a pawn here, as this would fork both pieces. So if the knight were to capture it, then the pawn could capture it and it'd be a fork. Knight captures e5, this is what happened in the game. D captures e5, and as of move 8, XQC lost a piece. g5, he's trying to distract Pokimane, as if this were to capture, the bishop could just capture this, and there would be no longer a fork. Bishop g3, but by playing g5, this severely weakens the king side, so you likely won't be castling kingside. Although this was somewhat of an idea to distract the bishop. Knight h5, XQC just wants to get rid of the bishop here, although he'll lose his own bishop. He captures d6, knight captures g6. And first, she could have just played that, or even that, but she just captured back with the h-pawn. Queen captures d6. And Pokimane collects upon h7. Although this is quite tricky, as now the bishop's pinned and can get attacked quite easily. Queen b6, going after the b2 pawn, since the dark square bishop was traded off. Queen b3, just defending, and if the queen were to move, it would prevent this light square bishop from moving away, as it would attack the b7 pawn. So they just trade. Queen captures b3, and a captures b3. Now Pokimane has both a and h files for her rooks. e5, XQC is just advancing in the center, and e4, Pokimane is trying to threaten the center. Although it looks like the pawn can't be captured because of the bishop, but the bishop's really pinned, so the pawn can just be captured. And that's what happens. D captures e4, and thankfully she doesn't capture back. Instead, she brings out another piece to attack the doubled pawns. Bishop f5, defending, cannot get captured, of course, because of the pin. And this would win actually both rooks. f3, just attacking the center. And now XQC picks up the bishop. F captures e4, just gaining some space in the center. Long castles and long castles. Rook d3, attacking that pawn. Knight c4, putting a counterattack on the more important e5 pawn, as this pawn is somewhat irrelevant, as it's just a double pawn. And instead, they just rook trade. A better move, it's better to capture with the rook here, and then bring your king up to, let's say, there. Well, of course, defend the pawn first. But it's better to capture with the rook. Actually, there are pros and cons. Capturing with the rook gives the file, but it also breaks the pin, so you can capture the pawn. It depends. It's your preference. Pokimane decides to capture the king, and f6, just stabilizing the e5 pawn. Knight e3, attempting to go for that nice outpost on e4. Rook d8 check. Good move by XQC, breaking the pin and putting her in check. King e2, and bishop captures e4. Instead of defending the bishop and just trying to kick her out, as she's a very powerful piece here, just forcing the knight to stay there, guarding the g2 pawn. Instead, Pokimane attacks the f6 pawn. f5, defending the pawn, although now this pawn and this pawn is weaker from that. g4, attacking the pawn, and f4, although this does create a nice outpost for the knight over there. And that's where the knight jumps to, knight f5, and bishop captures in g2. Knight e7 check, king b8, and rook g6, putting pressure on the g5 pawn. f3, a nice interaction between the bishop and the pawn, just protecting each other. King f2, not allowing the pawn to push forward in the future, but this does allow rook d2 check. The king goes back to e1, just attacking the rook, and rook e2. King d1 and c6, just not allowing any back rank ideas. Rook g8, she goes rook g8 nevertheless. As you see, both her and him are low in time. King c7, knight d5. This just splendors a piece. As you see, time played an important factor. C captures d5 and rook g6. Instead of capturing on g5, he just doesn't allow the king to enter the game. She doesn't allow the king to enter the game. f2, this appears to just blunder rook, but on the next move, f1 is coming, which will create a queen and then lead checkmate. And this is what happened in the game. King e3, queen f3 check, he's just collecting all of her pawns. Rook g7, king c6, attacking the e5 pawn. King e2, defending the e5 pawn by pushing to e4. Rook e6, just trying to check him into oblivion. Rook h6, putting it on the open file, although this does just lead to checkmate. And rook g6 was her last move, as after queen f1, that was checkmate and the game was over. XQC won the match 2-0.